I have hands that have held a lot of things in 73 years. I've held a rifle in the jungles of Vietnam when I was 19 and stupid enough to think war was something a man survived with his soul still intact. I've held my wife Elena's hand while she pushed our daughter into the world, screaming, red-faced, furious at the cold air, the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I've held Elena again, 22 years later, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and endings, while machines beeped their slow farewell and her fingers went cold inside mine. I have held a lot of things, but nothing, not a rifle, not a dying woman's hand, not 22 years of silence in an empty house. Nothing ever felt as heavy as standing in my daughter Patrice's kitchen last Saturday, holding a paper plate with a thin slice of birthday cake on it, while she stood across the room and said those 4 words to someone else. "She's my real mom." She didn't even look at me when she said it. I should tell you about Patrice first, because if you only hear the end of this story, you'll think she's a villain. She isn't. She's my daughter. She has Elena's eyes, that particular shade of brown that looks almost gold in afternoon light, and my stubborn jaw, and a laugh that fills whatever room she's standing in. I raised her alone from the time she was 9 years old. I packed her lunches and drove her to soccer practice and sat in the back of her school plays and cried, both times, when she graduated, once from high school, once from college, because Elena should have been there and wasn't, and I cried for both of us. I was not a perfect father. I want to be honest about that. I worked too much in the years after Elena died, because working was the only thing that kept me from drowning. I missed recitals. I burned dinners. I didn't know how to talk about feelings, still don't, if I'm being honest, and there were years, especially the teenage years, when Patrice and I communicated mostly through notes left on the refrigerator and silences that stretched too long over the dinner table. But I was there. Every single day I was there. Patrice married Marcus 3 years ago. Good man, Marcus, solid, the kind of man who fixes things when they're broken and doesn't make a production of it. His mother, Diane, flew in from Atlanta for the wedding and has made herself a permanent fixture in Patrice's life ever since. I don't dislike Diane, that's important to say. She's a warm woman, generous, the kind of person who remembers your coffee order and asks about your knee surgery months after the fact. She and Patrice took to each other immediately, shopping trips, weekly phone calls, inside jokes I wasn't part of. I told myself this was good. Patrice had grown up without a mother. She deserved someone who could give her what I couldn't. I told myself that a lot. I told myself that when I wasn't invited to the spa weekend they took together last spring. I told myself that when Patrice called Diane first after she found out she was pregnant, my grandchild, and I heard about it as the 3rd phone call, not the 1st. I told myself that when holiday plans started centering around Atlanta, and I started spending Christmases with my neighbor Gerald and his family because Patrice and Marcus were doing the holidays with his family this year. I told myself she has what she needs, that's enough, that's enough, that's enough. Last Saturday was Patrice's 35th birthday. Marcus had organized a small party, maybe 20 people, friends from their neighborhood, a couple of Patrice's work colleagues, Diane and her husband Robert, who'd flown in for the occasion. I drove 40 minutes to get there, brought Patrice the edition of Their Eyes Were Watching God she'd mentioned wanting, the one with the original cover art, because she'd talked about it twice, and I'd written it down in the little notebook I keep in my truck's glove compartment. The notebook where I write down things my daughter says she wants, so I don't forget. The party was fine. I stood mostly near the edges of things, talking to Marcus's uncle about woodworking, accepting a beer I didn't really want. Patrice moved through the room like light, touching everyone, laughing, beautiful in that way Elena had been beautiful, from the inside out. Then came the cake. Marcus brought it out and everyone sang. Chocolate with raspberry filling, Patrice's favorite since she was 6 years old, when Elena used to make it from scratch every year, and the whole house smelled like something worth coming home to. I stood in the back and sang along and felt Elena's absence like a missing tooth, the way your tongue keeps finding the empty space, keeps being surprised by it, even years later. The song ended, everyone clapped. And then Marcus handed Patrice the knife, and said, "First slice goes to the most important woman in your life." He meant it as a sweet thing, I know that. He was smiling at his wife, proud and happy, not thinking about anything except the moment. Patrice looked out at the room. She looked at me, her father, the man who had raised her alone for 26 years. And then she looked at Diane, who was standing 3 feet to my left, and she walked toward her, and she cut a slice of cake, and she set it on a plate, and she pressed it into Diane's hands, and she said, "She's my real mom. She's everything I needed and didn't have." The room made that particular sound that rooms make when something has happened that everyone recognizes but no one knows how to address. A soft intake of breath. A few people suddenly very interested in their drinks. Diane looked uncomfortable. To her credit, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. I looked down at my paper plate. I thought about Elena. I thought about 1998, the year after she died, when Patrice stopped speaking for almost 3 months, not selectively, not sulking, but genuinely stopped, like grief had stolen her voice, and I used to read to her every night just so she could hear that words still existed and the world still made sentences. I thought about the night she was 16 and called me from a party, drunk, scared, and I drove 40 minutes in a rainstorm without a single word of anger, because all that mattered was that she'd called me. I thought about her college applications spread across our kitchen table and how I'd read every essay draft and never once told her what to say, only that what she had to say was worth saying. I thought about a lot of things in the space of about 4 seconds. And then I made a decision. I didn't make a scene. That's the thing people always expect, I think, that a man who has been hurt will break something, raise his voice, demand acknowledgement. That's not what I did. I set down my paper plate, very carefully, on the table beside me. I walked to where Marcus was standing with the cake knife, still smiling. A little oblivious to the temperature in the room, I put my hand on his shoulder. He turned, surprised, and I said, quietly, so only he could hear, "I'm going to step out for a bit. Tell Patrice I said happy birthday." And then I walked to the coat rack by the front door, collected my jacket, and I left. I sat in my truck in their driveway for a moment, not crying, something past crying, something that didn't have a name yet. Then I drove home. Here's what happened that I didn't know until Marcus called me the next morning. After I left, Diane pulled Patrice aside. Marcus told me his mother was in tears, genuinely, deeply upset. She said, "Patrice, honey, that man raised you. What did you just do?" And something in Patrice, hearing it from Diane of all people, cracked open. She called me that night. I let it go to voicemail because I was sitting on my porch, looking at the dark yard, not ready. She called again, voicemail. She called a third time, and I picked up. She was crying before I said a word, not the graceful kind of crying, the ugly kind, the kind that means something real is happening. "Daddy," she said, and that word, that one word, undid 30 years of armor. She said she didn't know why she did it. She said she loved Diane, but it wasn't the same, it had never been the same. And she thinks she'd been trying so hard to pretend she hadn't needed a mother that she'd convinced herself Diane had fixed something that was never fixable. And she'd wanted to believe it so badly that she'd said it out loud, in public, as if saying it would make it true. She said, "You were always enough, Daddy. You were always more than enough. I just didn't know how to say thank you for something that enormous. I still don't." I sat on my porch for a long time before I answered. I said, "I know, baby, I know." Because I did. Because that's the thing about being a parent. You spend your whole life doing something so large it has no edges, and you do it without receipts, without guarantees, without any promise that the person you're doing it for will ever be able to look at the full size of it and find the words. Sometimes they don't find the words until they're 35, and they've done something that hurt you and they're sitting with the damage they made. That's still finding the words, that still counts. She came over 2 days later. I made coffee. She brought the leftover birthday cake, a whole half of it, wrapped carefully in the same kind of aluminum foil Elena used to use. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where we did homework and fought and reconciled and grieved and grew up, both of us, side by side. She put the first slice on my plate. She didn't say anything, she didn't have to. I have hands that have held a lot of things in 73 years. The thing that has never left them, not once, not for a single day, is her.